Some time ago, Pastor Sam and I had a conversation about where we are in our community, in our common life, in our nation, in our world. And we agreed that we need to spend some time exploring with you something called hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics is a fancy word. It comes from the Greek god of messages, Hermes, hermeneutics, and it's the study of how we understand or interpret texts. And so today, I am going to do something I don't normally do, and I'm going to put my hermeneutic out front ahead of my sermon. Usually, a good preacher doesn't disclose his hermeneutic or doesn't make it an explicit part of this sermon, but I'm going to do that today. Now, Pastor Sam always puts a little bit of his hermeneutic in almost every sermon he preaches. And you know this when he references his understanding of cosmology and physics and biology. When he talks about the evolutionary unfolding of the love of God. Every time he does that, he's referencing his hermeneutic. He's referencing the way he interprets texts. Now, we do this all the time, and hermeneutics doesn't just apply to reading the biblical text, it applies to any text. It applies to a novel you might read, or a poem you might read, a movie you might see, a clip you may see on TikTok or Facebook. Hermeneutics has to do with the influences that texts have on us. And when you're not aware of the influence that texts have on you, texts have power over you. But as you become aware of how you are interpreting, how you are absorbing texts, it gives you better control of the messages you take in and absorb in your life. And so here's the basic approach to hermeneutics, and that's this: that all texts, biblical text, a novel, a poem, a song, a movie, a clip on TikTok or Facebook, every text has a context. And the context conveys the meaning of the text. Most of the time, the text is front and center. The text is what has our attention. The text is what we pay attention to, and the context is hidden. Sometimes it's neglected. Sometimes it's ignored. But it's the context that infuses the text with meaning. It's the context that gives the text power over you. Here's some examples. In 1935, Sinclair Lewis wrote a novel, a book called It Can't Happen Here. It was a social commentary on the rise of fascism in Europe. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, but it also was referencing the rise of fascism in the United States in a movement that was called the America First movement. And in It Can't Happen Here, Sinclair Lewis told the story of what would happen if it did happen here. You see, the context of It Can't Happen Here was the rise of global fascism. It infused the text with meaning. You see? In 1945, George Orwell wrote a book called Animal Farm. The context of Animal Farm was the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had 12 million soldiers in Europe. The combined arms of the United Kingdom and the United States was about 3 million. And the United States still had to deal with Japan in the Pacific. And the United States was busy transferring soldiers from the European theater of war to the Pacific theater of war. And so George Orwell wrote Animal Farm to project the danger of Soviet communism in Europe. That was the context of Animal Farm. And it can't happen here. Sinclair Lewis said, "Every man can be a king," he wrote, "so long as there's another man he could look down on." 1945, George Orwell wrote, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." In 1987, Thomas Wolfe wrote a book called The Bonfire of the Vanities. The context of The Bonfire of the Vanities was the absurd wealth of Wall Street. If you remember 1987, you remember that the era of the hostile takeover? That was what was happening in Wall Street. It was driven by this new app called a spreadsheet. Because business people could very quickly determine the value of a company using a spreadsheet, when before it was very hard and complicated. And so hostile takeovers were all the rage in the 1980s. And so Thomas Wolfe wrote a book, The Bonfire of the Vanities, to highlight the absurdity and the danger of wealth created on Wall Street. Now, there's a quote from Bonfire of the Vanities I would share with you, but it's a little offensive. Now, if you were in one of my Episcopalian congregations, I would share it because, I don't know, Episcopal congregations tend to be more tolerant of such things. And I don't know about Presbyterians. You guys are such nice people. And I don't want to offend you. Now, on the scale of offense, between 1 and 10, it's about a 6.5 or a 7. And so I don't know if I should share it with you or if I should leave it with you to look it up. Share it? Okay. This side wants me to share it. This side's not so sure. You guys can discuss it in session at your next meeting. So in Bonfire of the Vanities, talking about the absurd and dangerous wealth that was being generated on Wall Street in the 1980s, Thomas Wolfe said, "Bullshit reigns." You see, text requires context to convey meaning. So today, as we look at Mark 11 on this Palm Sunday, I want us to look at the text with a full appreciation of its context so that you can hear this Palm Sunday reading. I'm going to use Mark 11 with a more complete appreciation. Now, the context of Mark 11 involves two things. The first is the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome, I'm convinced, about 72 or 73 AD, or about 40 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That's important. The reason that's important is because the people who heard the Gospel of Mark, many of them either had first-hand experience of the ministry and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, or they'd heard the stories one person removed. Just 40 years. For example, if I were to tell you, 40 years ago was 1986, if I were to tell you that Ronald Reagan was a Democrat, that Bill Clinton was his vice president, and that Bill Clinton was elected president following the term of Ronald Reagan, how credible would you find that message? How credible would you find me as a messenger? If I tried to sell you that message, you wouldn't believe me at all. And the reason is not because you're historians of political history. The reason is because each and every one of you have had first-hand experience of both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. And so texts have limits based upon the experiences and the knowledge of the people who receive those texts. So when we think about Mark 11, which we're going to read, which was written in Rome in 72 AD, we want to keep in mind that the people who heard that text had first-hand knowledge of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Is that fair? The second thing we need to understand when we look at the context of Mark chapter 11 is that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and burned down the temple in 70 AD, just 2 or 3 years prior to the writing of the Gospel of Mark. And not only that in 71 AD, the Romans held a triumph for Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian was the emperor of Rome at the time, and Titus was his son, who was the conquering general who destroyed Jerusalem. And so in 71 AD, the Romans hosted a triumph for Titus, the conquering general of Jerusalem. Now, you cannot appreciate Mark chapter 11 or Palm Sunday without understanding the context of the Roman triumph that was held in 71 AD. Now, this was a Roman triumph. A Roman triumph was a celebration and a projection of the menacing power of Rome. The Romans had a law that a general and his army could not enter the city of Rome unless they were offered a triumph by the Senate of Rome. A triumph was a parade in which the conquering general was allowed to enter Rome with his army for 24 hours. And it was a highly orchestrated event. For some people, to be the biggest event in the lifetime of a Roman. So this is what a triumph involved. First, it had to be approved by vote by the Senate. And conquering generals were a risky thing, because not everybody in the Senate would have supported him. He would have represented a political rival to some. So for the Senate to approve a triumph, there was a lot of lobbying, a lot of negotiation, a lot of bribery, a lot of give and take that would finally lead to the vote to approve the triumph. Then after the vote was approved, the triumph had to be organized. Now here's what a triumph involved. It was a long parade. At the front of the parade was a display images of tabloids of the conquering region. So in 71 AD, there would have been a wagon or several wagons that carried great big portraitures of the Temple of Jerusalem, where it showed images of the walled city of Jerusalem. Perhaps where it showed hills filled with grapes and fields full of wheat. That display had to be created. Following the display came wagons full of spoils, gold and silver that had been plundered from the region. Artifacts from the temple would have been on display on another wagon. The menorah, the bulls in the front of the temple, the altars in the temple. All of this had to be collected and shipped from Jerusalem to Rome. And then, following the spoils, were the captives. The leading men and women of Jerusalem would have been dressed in their finery and marched behind the spoils. And behind the leading men and women of Rome were the common people of Jerusalem, were the common people of Jerusalem. Hundreds of people would have paraded past jeering Romans. And then behind the captives came Titus. Titus would have been riding in a chariot pulled by 6 white horses. He would have been dressed in purple. His face would have been painted red. This costume, vestments of purple and his face painted red, was intentionally to portray the god Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And as Titus rode through Rome in triumph, the message was clear. Here is Jupiter Optimus Maximus incarnate, the conqueror of the God of the Jews. And then behind Titus in his chariot would have come his Roman legions. And they were singing mighty, offensive songs. And the message was very clear. An army lives on the edge of chaos. They don't observe the niceties of civilized society. They are an organized mob ready to do violence. This triumph, this parade had one intent, was to project the menacing power of Rome. You see? As it wound through the streets of Rome, it turned onto the Via Sacra, the sacred way. And it came to a stop at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And there at the foot of the temple, the leading citizens of Rome were killed. A sacrifice to Jupiter. And then the common people were sold into slavery. And Titus, the triumphator, would mount the steps of the temple Jupiter with the blood of sacrifice on his hands. '71 AD. Mark, a disciple of the Apostle Peter, the Jewish community in Rome, the Christians of Rome, witnessed that triumph. as the Romans degraded and demeaned and ridiculed Yahweh. That's the context for the reading that we hear today on Palm Sunday. Context informs the meaning of the text. Now, will you hear again this reading of Palm Sunday from Mark chapter 11? And as I read it, hold that Roman triumph in your mind and see how it infuses this text with meaning. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say, 'The Lord needs it.'" And we'll send it back immediately. They went away and found the colt tied near a door outside in the street. And they were untying it. Some of the bystanders said to them, what are you doing untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said. And they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna!" They were singing, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around, he went out to Bethany with the 12. What is a Roman triumph? It is a celebration and a projection of the menacing power of Rome. What is a Jesus triumph? Where are the spoils? Instead of gold and silver piled up on wagons, you have branches of palm cut from the fields. Expressions of God's created order. You have the cloaks of the people laid out before him. Free offerings of devotion. Where are the captives to be sacrificed? Where are the 6 white horses in the chariots? No. Just this young colt that's never been ridden. Have you ever ridden a young colt that's never been ridden before? Hold on tight. Jesus rides an unbroken colt who is yielded and responsive to the needs of the Lord of the cosmos. Where's Jesus' purple robe? Where's his red face to project his claim to be the incarnate of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus? When you're Jesus, you don't need such costumes. Because you are the incarnate Son of the living God. You don't have to portray it. You don't have to pretend. And at the end of your triumph, when you come to the temple, where's the slaughter? Where's the sacrifice? The text says Jesus just went in the temple, looked around, and because it was late, he returned to Bethany. There's no sacrifice in Jesus' triumph, because Jesus is the one to whom sacrifice is made. And what is more, Jesus is the one who will give up his life to be a sacrifice for many.
Whatever burden weighs you down, whatever flaw, whatever trauma you've experienced or dream that's been left unfulfilled in your life, you can know this. You are an expression of the creative love and power of God. You cannot be separated from God's love. God seeks your perfection and not your destruction.